Claire Whitmore was the perfect image of wealth and elegance in suburban Texas, and Arjun Verma was the quiet, ambitious 24-year-old Indian neighbor who never imagined his life would end inside her mansion, killed by the very man whose wife he was secretly seeing. In the heart of one of Houston's wealthiest suburbs stood a pristine white mansion with sprawling lawns, tall iron gates, and a quiet stillness that gave the impression of perfection. Claire Whitmore lived here, a 46-year-old woman known for her beauty, her perfectly styled blonde hair, and the expensive clothes she wore like armor. Her life from the outside seemed flawless. Married to Daniel Whitmore, a powerful real estate tycoon, Claire was seen as a symbol of Southern elegance and fortune, but appearances, like glass, can hide fractures until they shatter. Claire's days were long and uneventful. With no children and a husband constantly away on business trips, the silence in the house grew heavier with time. The high ceilings and marble floors echoed with nothing but the ticking of clocks and the occasional humming of maids who had learned not to ask questions. Claire spent her time swimming in their heated pool, reading half-finished books, and walking through a garden with a glass of wine in hand. The mansion was beautiful, but it felt like a cage, a luxurious, suffocating cage. Her marriage to Daniel had once been passionate. They had met at a fundraiser when Claire was just 26 and working in interior design. Daniel was 15 years older and already on his way to building an empire. He had swept her off her feet with charm and money, promising her the world. For a time he delivered, but over the years, love had turned to routine, and affection was replaced with polite conversations and lonely dinners. Daniel became consumed with work, and Claire, despite all she had, felt invisible. It was during one of her idle afternoons in early spring that she noticed a moving truck outside the vacant house next door. Curious and slightly bored, Claire watched from her window as a new family arrived. She recognized the signs immediately: a mother checking off lists, a father supervising the movers, and a young man helping with boxes. They were Indian, clearly well-mannered, and seemed like they were trying to settle into the unfamiliar world of wealthy Texas suburbia. But it was the young man who caught Claire's attention. He was tall, athletic, and probably in his early 20s. There was something about the way he carried himself, quiet confidence without arrogance, that intrigued her. Over the next few days, Claire found excuses to linger near the garden wall that separated their properties. She'd water plants that didn't need watering or pretend to tend to her roses. Eventually, the young man introduced himself as Arjun Verma. He was 24, studying data science at a university nearby, and had moved with his parents to Houston for his father's job in tech. He was polite, respectful, and noticeably intelligent. Their first conversation was short, filled with the kind of small talk that people forget within hours, but Claire didn't forget. Soon their encounters became frequent. A wave from across the driveway, a smile during morning jogs, a few words exchanged over the fence. Claire began looking forward to these brief moments more than anything else in her day. In Arjun, she found a spark she hadn't felt in years. It was innocent at first, just attention she hadn't received in a long time, but underneath that, something darker and more dangerous was already beginning to form. As the days slipped into weeks, Claire found herself thinking about Arjun more often. What began as a fleeting distraction quickly turned into an emotional fixation. Every casual conversation felt thrilling, every accidental touch electric. She started dressing differently, more relaxed but deliberate, choosing light fabrics and subtle perfume. It had been years since anyone had looked at her the way Arjun did, with eyes that held admiration instead of indifference. The loneliness that once weighed her down now had a temporary cure, and she welcomed it without question. Arjun, for his part, was flattered. Claire was beautiful, worldly, and confident in a way that girls his age were not. She spoke with ease about things he'd only read in books: travel, art, business, and human behavior. She complimented him in ways that felt sincere. There was an unspoken tension between them, but both chose to ignore the obvious for as long as they could. Arjun had grown up in a conservative household. His parents had high expectations, and any romantic involvement, especially one so scandalous, would have been met with harsh judgment. Yet that very danger made everything more exciting. Their friendship evolved in subtle, intentional steps. Claire began inviting Arjun for coffee in her garden. She said it was safer than meeting in public, and besides, she enjoyed the privacy. They would talk for hours while the world outside remained unaware of what was beginning. He shared his ambitions, his frustration with being treated like a child by his parents, and his struggle to find belonging in a community so different from the one he grew up in. Claire listened, encouraged him, and offered validation he hadn't known he needed. What started as innocent companionship shifted into something unmistakably intimate. Claire began texting him late at night, under a fake name saved in his phone. They would joke, share secrets, and send carefully crafted messages that hinted at deeper feelings. One afternoon, as they stood too close near the garden wall, the invisible line between friendship and desire finally snapped. That single moment of closeness led to many more, each one more reckless than the last. They started meeting inside the mansion during Daniel's business trips. Claire knew her husband's schedule by heart, and she used it to create a false sense of safety. She would prepare wine, dim the lights, and play soft music to drown out the silence that once haunted her. Arjun, hesitant at first, soon found himself completely entangled. He had never imagined himself in such a situation, but Claire's presence was magnetic. What began as fascination became obsession. He began skipping classes, lying to his parents, and crafting excuses just to be near her. But love built on secrecy is always fragile. Unknown to them, their affair had started to attract attention. A retired neighbor with too much time and a window facing the Whitmore backyard noticed the unusual patterns. The long visits, the timing, the way Claire lingered by the fence. One evening, the neighbor took out a phone and quietly began recording. What was once private was now evidence waiting to surface, and just beyond the reach of their passion, consequences were beginning to take shape. Daniel Whitmore had built his empire by knowing how to read people. He understood silence better than words, and he trusted instincts sharpened over years of business deals, betrayals, and boardroom games. When he began noticing changes in Claire, he didn't need confirmation. He already knew something was wrong. Her sudden bursts of energy, the way she smiled at her phone, and her eagerness to send him off on business trips were all signs. He'd seen this before in other marriages, in whispers at parties. Now it was happening in his own home, but Daniel wasn't the kind of man to confront with emotion. Instead, he acted strategically. First, he feigned ignorance, keeping up appearances while quietly investigating. He called in a favor from a private investigator he had used in the past, a man who didn't ask questions and delivered results fast. Within days, Daniel had photos, grainy but clear enough, Arjun stepping through the side gate, Claire waiting at the door. Another image showed them on the balcony, standing too close. It was all the proof he needed, yet he didn't act immediately. Instead, he waited and watched, like a hunter observing prey. In the meantime, Daniel began cleaning up his affairs. He met with his legal team under the pretense of estate planning. He adjusted his will, redirecting major assets into protected accounts and trusts that couldn't be easily accessed. He instructed his financial advisor to move a portion of funds to an offshore entity registered under a shell company. On paper, it looked like a man preparing for retirement. In reality, he was isolating Claire from everything he had built. Then came the surveillance. Daniel had security cameras discreetly installed in parts of the house Claire rarely entered. His home office, the hallway outside the guest room, even the living room ceiling. He placed a GPS tracker under Claire's car and enabled tracking on her phone using an app she had forgotten she'd installed. With every passing day, the illusion of ignorance grew stronger. Claire continued her affair, believing she was operating in secret. But her husband knew her every move. Daniel's calm demeanor only deepened the illusion. He complimented her more often, brought home flowers, and even suggested they take a short trip together, something they hadn't done in years. Claire was suspicious, but guilt made her receptive. She thought perhaps he had sensed the emotional distance and was trying to fix things. She didn't realize she was being played. Eventually, Daniel reached out to Arjun. He used a false pretense in offering a freelance opportunity with one of his real estate projects. It was positioned as a chance to build experience and connections. Claire, unaware of the contact, encouraged Arjun to accept. She believed it could be a way to ease the tension between them and perhaps prepare for the possibility of going public with their relationship. Arjun, though nervous, agreed. The meeting was set for a Friday evening when Claire would be attending a charity gala she had nearly forgotten about. Daniel offered to stay home and meet Arjun in his study. Claire left the house that evening thinking she had taken one more step toward freedom. But what she didn't know was that Daniel had already decided how this would end, and neither she nor Arjun had any idea just how far he was willing to go. Rain fell in sheets that Friday evening, darkening the sky long before night officially arrived. The thunder was distant but persistent, rumbling like a warning that no one could hear. Arjun pulled into the Whitmore driveway just after 7 p.m., nerves tightening in his chest. He had worn his best button-down shirt, ironed and tucked, and carried a leather folder with mock drafts of property analysis. Something Daniel had asked him to bring. It felt surreal to be invited into the house by the very man whose wife he was seeing in secret. Yet Arjun convinced himself that maybe this was progress, a first step toward honesty, toward something real. Daniel greeted him at the door, calm and polite, dressed casually in dark jeans and a navy sweater. His smile was thin, practiced. He led Arjun into the study, a warm, richly furnished room filled with bookshelves, abstract art, and a fireplace quietly burning in the background. They sat facing each other across a large oak desk. Arjun placed his folder on the table, trying to steady his hands. Daniel barely glanced at it. Instead, he poured them both a drink, whiskey neat, and offered one without a word. Minutes passed in silence. Arjun waited for Daniel to bring up the project, but the questions never came. Instead, Daniel began talking about trust, loyalty, and consequences. His voice remained even, almost gentle, but the words carried weight. Arjun started to sense that something was wrong, very wrong. He stood up, uncertain, saying he should probably leave. That's when Daniel reached into the drawer. Claire returned home just after 9 p.m., drenched from the sudden downpour, her heels clicking across the marble floor. The house was eerily quiet. She called for Daniel but received no reply. As she stepped into the hallway, a strange metallic scent hit her. Her heart pounded as she walked toward the study, the door slightly ajar. What she saw inside made her stop breathing. The room was in disarray, books scattered on the floor, a chair overturned, blood soaked into the expensive Persian rug. Arjun lay motionless, his head tilted unnaturally, eyes half open. Beside him, Daniel stood calmly, his shirt stained, his hand wrapped around a pistol. He turned slowly toward Claire, as if expecting her. He spoke before she could scream. He told her Arjun had lunged at him, that a confrontation had turned violent, and he had acted in self-defense. Claire was frozen, unable to speak, unable to process. Nothing about Daniel's expression said fear. There was no panic, no confusion, only control. When she reached for her phone, Daniel stepped forward and grabbed her wrist. He warned her that calling the police would destroy them both. The scandal, the trial, the exposure of the affair. Everything would unravel. Instead, he proposed they fix it together. Claire, dazed and terrified, didn't resist when he told her to help him clean the room. She moved mechanically, scrubbing blood from wood, gathering broken glass, unable to think clearly. Later that night, in the dead of darkness, they drove to a remote piece of land Daniel owned outside the city. It was secluded, undeveloped, and far from any surveillance. They buried Arjun in a shallow grave beneath a dying oak tree, covered him with wet soil and silence. Daniel never raised his voice, never faltered. Claire, numb and shaking, helped cover the last patch of earth, her tears lost in the rain. The mansion was quiet when they returned, but nothing about it felt like home anymore. A terrible secret now lived within its walls, and the woman who once thought she had found love now lived in fear of the man who had taken it away. The days that followed were marked by silence. Claire barely spoke, barely slept, moving through the mansion like a shadow of herself. She kept replaying that night in her mind. Arjun's still body, Daniel's emotionless stare, the sound of soil hitting the ground. Every detail clung to her memory like a stain that wouldn't wash out. Daniel, on the other hand, returned to his routines with eerie ease. He went to meetings, answered calls, and made dinner reservations, all while pretending that nothing had happened. It was as if burying a body was just another errand on his list, but the world outside was shifting. Arjun's parents became worried when their son didn't return home that night. At first, they assumed he was with friends or working late, but by the next morning, panic set in. His phone was off, his location couldn't be tracked, and he hadn't responded to any messages. They reported him missing, and within hours, investigators were reviewing his last known whereabouts. A neighbor came forward, one who had quietly observed the strange connection between Arjun and Claire. She handed over grainy photos and a short video she had recorded weeks earlier. It showed Arjun walking toward the Whitmore residence late in the evening, disappearing past the gate. Police questioned the Whitmores almost immediately. Daniel, calm and calculated, told them that Arjun had stopped by briefly for a job discussion and left around 7:30. Claire echoed his story, but her voice shook and her words stumbled. Detectives noticed her pale skin, her trembling hands, and the way she avoided eye contact. They weren't convinced. A search warrant was quickly granted. Investigators combed through the Whitmore home, and it didn't take long before they found inconsistencies. A section of the study carpet was freshly replaced. Underneath, they discovered traces of blood. The cleaning had been rushed, incomplete. Worse still, they retrieved footage from a cloud-connected security system that Daniel had forgotten to fully disable. It showed Arjun arriving. It showed the two men entering the study, but there was no footage of Arjun ever leaving. Claire's unraveling accelerated. She could barely eat. She spent long hours sitting alone, staring at nothing. When detectives returned for a second round of questioning, she broke. It started with small hesitations, then contradictions, and finally a complete collapse. In a tearful confession behind closed doors, Claire told the truth, everything from the affair to the confrontation, to the burial in the woods. She led them to the body herself. Daniel was arrested at his office later that day, still in a tailored suit, still wearing the same watch he had the night of the murder. The evidence was overwhelming. Blood, surveillance footage, Claire's confession, and the body, all aligned with a timeline he could no longer deny. At the trial, Claire testified against him. Her sentence was reduced in exchange for cooperation, but her reputation was shattered. The story became national news. A rich woman's forbidden affair, a jealous husband's cold-blooded act, and a young man whose only crime was falling in love. The mansion was eventually sold, its windows boarded up for months. Neighbors whispered about the scandal long after the headlines faded, but for those involved, the truth remained a haunting presence. Claire lived on in quiet disgrace, Arjun was mourned by a devastated family, and Daniel spent his days behind bars, unrepentant. What began as a secret romance ended in betrayal, violence, and the complete destruction of 3 lives.